When we think about the concept of war, images of soldiers marching, tanks rumbling, and fighter jets soaring through the skies come to mind. We picture battlefields filled with chaos, destruction, and the high stakes of human survival. But what if I told you that a different kind of war has been raging right under our noses? One that isn't fought with weapons, but with tariffs, sanctions.
The US and China has intensified, with Washington confirming taxes of up to 145% on Beijing, which has responded with 84% tariffs of its own.
And the intricate webs of global economics. What if I told you that the world is already in the midst of a trade war so intense, it could reshape the global order as we know it? The world we live in today is increasingly defined by the rise of economic superpowers. In the past century, the United States has led the charge, guiding the world towards a globalized future, a future where trade flows freely across borders, powered by the free market and innovation, one that has been rising for decades: China. From its roots as a largely agrarian society, China has transformed itself into an economic titan. It's a country that manufactures the goods consumed by the entire world, and with its burgeoning technological prowess, it is positioning itself to lead the next wave of global development. The US and China are no longer just two countries. They are two superpowers vying for global dominance, in a competition where the stakes couldn't be higher. In 2018, this economic rivalry turned into something far more intense. The US, led by President Donald Trump, officially declared a trade war on China. What started as a simple dispute over tariffs quickly escalated into a global struggle that involved industries, governments, and even everyday consumers. The trade war wasn't just about trade. It was about power. It was about which nation would control the future of the world's economy. Would China continue its rise as the factory of the world? Or would the US manage to hold its ground and preserve its dominance in the global marketplace? Would tariffs, sanctions, and political maneuvering really be enough to change the tide of history? What made this trade war unique was the fact that it wasn't just a battle over money. It was a reflection of something much larger: the changing dynamics of power in the 21st century. The US and China's economic competition wasn't just about the exchange of goods. It was about ideologies, global influence, and the future of technological innovation. From the outset, President Trump's administration made it clear that this war would not just be about trade imbalances or unfair practices. It would be a challenge to China's rise, to its global economic strategy, and to the very foundation of international trade that had long benefited the US and its allies. At the heart of the trade war were the tariffs, taxes placed on goods imported from China to the United States. While it might seem like a straightforward economic issue, these tariffs represented far more than just a disagreement over prices. For President Trump, this was an opportunity to level the playing field, to address what he saw as China's unfair trade practices, and to protect American jobs and industries that had been outsourced overseas. And, as with any major geopolitical conflict, the consequences of these actions would ripple throughout the world. The tariffs imposed by the US were not just limited to steel and aluminum. They quickly spread to nearly every sector of the economy, and from textiles to machinery. In response, China retaliated, imposing tariffs of its own on American goods: soybeans, cars, and even high-end whiskey. The result? A tit-for-tat cycle of escalating tariffs that left both economies reeling, with the global economy uncertain of what would come next. But the trade war was more than just about the US and China. It became a global issue, as the effects of the conflict were felt across the world. Economies that were once heavily reliant on China for exports found themselves caught in the crossfire, and the ripple effects of the trade war disrupted global supply chains. Companies that had built their businesses around the low-cost manufacturing capabilities of China found themselves scrambling to adapt to a new reality. Investors grew wary of the uncertainty, and the global stock markets trembled at the prospect of a prolonged conflict. As the trade war dragged on, the world began to realize that this was not just about two nations fighting for economic supremacy. It was a battle for the future. At the center of this battle was something even more significant than trade itself: technological supremacy. As China advanced in fields like artificial intelligence, telecommunications, and 5G technology, The US saw a direct threat to its position as the world's leader in innovation. The US government, under Trump, was adamant that it could not allow China to dominate these high-tech industries, fearing that it would lose not just economic power, but political and military influence as well. The trade war, then, was not just an economic clash. It was a geopolitical struggle. It was a contest of ideas, of systems, and of futures. Would the US continue to hold the reins of global leadership, or would China rise to challenge the West's vision of the future? Would the US succeed in reshaping China's economic policies, or would China assert itself as an equal, if not superior, economic force? The impact of the trade war wasn't just felt in boardrooms or government chambers. It was felt by everyday people. As tariffs drove up the cost of goods, consumers in the US began to see their wallets stretched thinner. Farmers who relied on exports to China faced immense challenges as their markets disappeared. Companies that had spent years building relationships with Chinese manufacturers suddenly found themselves faced with tariffs that made their goods more expensive and less competitive. And in China, the government's efforts to safeguard its economic interests meant that the country's growth slowed, leaving millions of people uncertain about their future. Chapter 1. The origins of a global power struggle. For much of the 20th century, the global order was dictated by one singular power, the United States of America. Dominating economically, militarily, and diplomatically, the US stood as the undisputed global leader. With its victory in the Cold War, the dismantling of the Soviet Union, and its pivotal role in shaping international institutions, the US felt secure in its position as the world's foremost superpower. But the 21st century would prove to be a time of unprecedented change, shifting alliances, economic rebalancing, and the rise of new global contenders. Chief among them, a rising power from the East that had remained hidden in the shadows for centuries: China. China's history, rich in ancient dynasties and cultural heritage, had long been marked by periods of both glory and hardship. From the heights of the Tang and Song dynasties, when it was a global leader in science, technology, and trade, to the depths of the Opium Wars, when it was carved up by foreign powers, China's modern history has been defined by a push and pull between isolation and integration. By the time the Communist Party took power in 1949 under Chairman Mao Zedong, China was a country shattered by years of civil war, foreign invasion, and internal chaos. The nation faced economic disaster and political instability. Mao's radical policies, such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, left China deeply impoverished and isolated from the global community. It wasn't until the late 1970s that China began its first steps toward economic recovery. Mao's death in 1976 created a power vacuum, and a new generation of leaders emerged with a vision of transforming China into a modern, prosperous nation. That vision came from one man, Deng Xiaoping. Deng was a pragmatist. He recognized that China's outdated, centralized economic system was holding the country back from realizing its true potential. He also knew that in order to rise to power on the world stage, China needed to radically change its approach to economic management. As he famously said, "It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." Deng's reforms would pave the way for a complete overhaul of the Chinese economy. His policies focused on opening China to foreign investment, decentralizing state control over industry, and embracing market-oriented economic reforms. This shift toward capitalism, while still under the auspices of the Communist Party, was revolutionary. Deng's most significant reform came in 1978, when he launched the Reform and Opening Up policy. The centerpiece of this policy was the establishment of special economic zones, SEZs, in coastal areas such as Shenzhen. These zones were intended to attract foreign capital and technology by offering tax incentives, relaxed regulations, and a workforce eager to work for low wages. Foreign investors, primarily from the West, flocked to China, setting up manufacturing plants and factories. This marked the beginning of China's economic transformation, from a poor, agrarian nation to the world's factory. The scale of China's transformation in the following decades was unprecedented. Its economy grew at a pace that was hard for even the most experienced economists to fathom. While the United States, Western Europe, and Japan were dealing with their own internal challenges, whether the fallout from the Cold War, economic recessions, or political crises, China was quietly building an economic powerhouse. By the mid-1990s, China was an economic juggernaut, with manufacturing output skyrocketing and its exports flooding global markets. By the early 2000s, China had begun to reap the benefits of its open-door policies. As the world's largest manufacturing base, China could produce goods at a fraction of the cost of Western countries. Its cheap labor force and sprawling supply chains were highly attractive to multinational corporations, who flocked to China in search of lower production costs. This allowed American companies to increase their profit margins, while at the same time offering affordable goods to consumers back home. But while the US was benefiting from the influx of cheap Chinese goods, the economic consequences were starting to show. China's growing manufacturing capacity came at a cost to American workers. As companies moved production to China, millions of jobs in the United States, especially in manufacturing, disappeared. The so-called Rust Belt, which once thrived on the back of steel, automobiles, and factory production, began to wither. For the average American worker, the effect was devastating. Jobs that once provided a stable and growing middle-class lifestyle were now being replaced by low-wage service sector positions. Small towns and communities that relied on the success of local industries saw their economies crumble as plants closed down or moved overseas. It wasn't just a question of lost jobs, it was a cultural shift. The American worker, who had long seen the US as the global economic leader, was now beginning to feel marginalized. This economic shift was compounded by China's increasing dominance in the global manufacturing sector. By the mid-2000s, China was the world's largest exporter of goods. And with this increasing economic power came a corresponding geopolitical shift. As the US remained entrenched in conflicts in the Middle East and focused on maintaining its military presence in the region, China was busy making economic inroads throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. One of the most important aspects of China's strategy was its ability to take advantage of the global trading system. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, a move that allowed the country to integrate more deeply into the global economy. But rather than simply opening up its markets as expected, China found ways to use the global trading system to its advantage. It manipulated its currency to make its goods even cheaper, circumvented intellectual property laws, and forced foreign companies to transfer technology to their Chinese counterparts in exchange for access to the market. In the US, many industries, especially technology companies, began to feel the brunt of these policies. Theft of intellectual property became rampant. Chinese companies were accused of reverse engineering American products, copying designs, and selling them at a lower cost. Meanwhile, the US was growing increasingly dependent on China. By the early 2010s, the trade deficit between the US and China had reached staggering heights. In 2015, the US imported over $500 billion worth of goods from China, while exporting only around $100 billion in return. This widening trade imbalance signaled a structural problem in the global economic order. American consumers were benefiting from cheap Chinese goods, but the cost was being borne by the American worker and American industry. The hollowing out of manufacturing jobs, the loss of technological leadership, and the increasing dependency on Chinese imports were creating an uncomfortable and unsustainable situation. It was clear that China's economic ascent posed a serious challenge to American interests, not just in trade but in technology, military power, and global influence. As China invested in high-tech industries, from telecommunications to artificial intelligence, it became evident that China was not just looking to dominate the manufacturing sector. The country had set its sights on becoming the world's dominant technological power. Companies like Huawei, Alibaba, and Tencent were rapidly gaining market share in the global tech industry. By 2018, Huawei had become a global leader in telecommunications equipment, particularly in 5G technology, which is expected to be the backbone of the global digital economy in the coming decades. The US saw China's rise as a direct threat to its leadership in global tech. America's Silicon Valley, which had long been the heart of global innovation, was now competing with China's tech giants, which were able to grow rapidly thanks to the Chinese government's substantial investments and protectionist policies. But the US was not the only country that was concerned. European nations, who had also benefited from China's cheap manufacturing, were now facing the reality of a China that was growing increasingly assertive, both economically and geopolitically. China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, launched in 2013, was the clearest sign of China's strategic ambitions. With the BRI, China sought to build infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, and telecommunications networks across Asia, Africa, and Europe. These investments gave China access to critical resources and markets, while at the same time increasing its political influence over these regions. The BRI was a powerful tool of economic diplomacy, one that would expand China's reach far beyond its borders and provide it with influence over countries in Asia, Africa, and even Europe. But as China grew more influential, tensions with the US began to rise. With the rise of China came the rise of a new kind of rivalry, one that was rooted not in military conflict, but in economic, technological, and political power. The US could no longer afford to ignore the rising challenge from China. And so, when Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, he brought with him a vision of confronting China head-on. Trump's trade policies, which included imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, would mark the beginning of an economic war. Trump's administration was the first to take concrete action against China's unfair trade practices, accusing the country of intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, and unfair trade practices. The trade war would have far-reaching consequences, not only for the US and China, but for the entire global economic system. Chapter 2. The Trade War, the US versus China. By 2018, the global economic landscape was no longer as predictable as it once had been. The rise of China, coupled with a growing sense of economic dissatisfaction in the United States, created the perfect storm for a dramatic shift in the trade relationships between the two largest economies in the world. The roots of this trade war went far deeper than the tariffs and counter-tariffs that would soon dominate the headlines. For decades, the economic relationship between the United States and China had been defined by an overwhelming trade imbalance, as China became the world's largest exporter of goods, while the US maintained its position as a global consumer. But this economic interdependence was far from harmonious. China's economic rise had not only shifted the global balance of power, it had also fundamentally altered the global supply chain. China's entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001 accelerated its transformation from a primarily agrarian society into the world's factory. The country became the manufacturing powerhouse, producing everything from basic electronics to high-end machinery. While this was a win for consumers worldwide, who were now able to purchase cheaper goods, it had profound implications for countries like the United States, where manufacturing jobs began to disappear in large numbers. The consequences of China's economic boom were felt most acutely in the US Rust Belt, where factories that once employed thousands of Americans were now sitting idle, or worse, had been sold off and relocated to China in search of cheaper labor. The American working class, particularly in industrial towns, saw their jobs and livelihoods disappear. For many, this economic shift seemed like a betrayal, an unbalanced global trade system that benefited China at the expense of American workers. The pain was most evident in cities like Detroit, Michigan, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, once thriving industrial hubs, now left struggling to redefine their place in the modern economy. The loss of these jobs was not just an economic issue. It became a deeply emotional one, feeding into growing national discontent. The Trump administration's decision to initiate a trade war with China was in many ways a direct response to these frustrations. Donald Trump, who had campaigned on a platform of America First, had repeatedly promised to tackle the massive trade deficit between the US and China. Trump was vocal in his criticism of China's economic practices, accusing the country of engaging in unfair trade practices, including intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, and the forced transfer of American technology. But more than that, Trump's administration saw China's rise as a direct challenge to US economic and geopolitical dominance. Trump's trade policy focused on addressing what he saw as the root causes of the trade imbalance. Central to his strategy was the imposition of tariffs, essentially taxes on goods imported into the US. The US government hoped that these tariffs would achieve several goals. Firstly, to make Chinese goods more expensive, which would push US consumers to buy domestic products. Secondly, to pressure China into changing its trade practices, such as intellectual property theft and forced technology transfers. And finally, to restore America's manufacturing sector by protecting it from foreign competition. However, while the strategy was bold, it was far from simple. In the early stages of the trade war, the US imposed tariffs on a wide range of Chinese goods, from steel and aluminum to electronics and machinery. The Trump administration's goal was clear: to force China to the bargaining table by making their exports more expensive, thus hurting Chinese companies and pushing them to negotiate new terms. The first wave of tariffs included a 25% tariff on steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum, which impacted not only Chinese exports, but also global trade as a whole. The tariffs were initially framed as a necessary step to protect American industries from unfair Chinese practices. However, the broader impact was felt in unexpected ways. As US companies began to feel the effects of the tariffs, the economic strain became apparent. American manufacturers, who relied heavily on cheap Chinese imports for components, found themselves facing higher production costs. For companies like Apple, Nike, and General Motors, who had moved their manufacturing operations to China in search of low-cost labor, these tariffs meant that their production costs had skyrocketed. And as the companies passed these costs on to consumers, American families began to feel the pinch. The average American consumer saw the cost of goods rise, whether it was the price of an iPhone, a car, or a pair of sneakers. The Chinese government, predictably, did not take the imposition of tariffs lying down. It retaliated swiftly with its own set of tariffs on US products, with a focus on American agricultural exports. China's initial response targeted products like soybeans, pork, and corn, key exports for American farmers in rural heartland states like Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. This move was strategic, aiming to hit the US where it hurt most, its heartland, where support for Trump was strong. The tariffs on soybeans, in particular, were devastating, as China had been the largest market for US soybeans. The trade war not only impacted American farmers, but also sowed divisions within the US political landscape. While some industries benefited from the tariffs, many American farmers, whose livelihoods depended on exports to China, found themselves caught in the middle of a global power struggle. As the trade war dragged on through 2018 and into 2019, the stakes grew higher. The US imposed additional tariffs on Chinese goods, including electronics, furniture, and machinery, amounting to billions of dollars in imports. The Chinese government responded with tariffs of its own, hitting US products like cars, electronics, and even bourbon. The retaliation had a direct impact on American manufacturers and industries that relied on China as a key market. The situation was further complicated by the fact that China had begun to reduce its imports of US agricultural goods, which placed American farmers in an even more precarious position. The trade war escalated in a way that no one could have predicted. As tariffs piled up, both countries began to feel the pressure. While the US economy was not immediately crushed by the trade war, it became clear that the global economy was slowing down. Stock markets across the world saw volatility, and global supply chains were disrupted. The broader global economic uncertainty caused by the trade war resulted in reduced investment in key sectors, including technology, automotive, and retail. Investors and businesses began to pull back, worried that the trade war might trigger a broader recession. One of the most significant aspects of this trade war was its technological component. Technology had become the new battleground for global economic power, with the US and China both vying for dominance in fields like 5G, artificial intelligence, and high-tech manufacturing. China's most prominent tech company, Huawei, became the focal point of the conflict. As one of the world's largest producers of telecommunications equipment, Huawei had become a leader in the development of 5G technology. But the US government viewed Huawei as a national security threat, accusing the company of being a front for the Chinese government, which could use Huawei's equipment to spy on American citizens and businesses. The Trump administration took a hard line against Huawei, blacklisting the company and preventing US companies from selling vital technology to the Chinese firm. This move set off a global debate about the future of 5G and China's growing influence in the tech industry. American tech companies were caught in the crossfire, as they relied on Chinese markets for growth, but were also being forced to choose sides in the US-China tech war. The conflict over Huawei was just one example of how the US and China were vying for technological supremacy, each seeking to control the future of the digital economy. In addition to technology, the US-China trade war had a profound impact on global supply chains. Globalization had led to an intricate web of supply chains where raw materials, components, and finished products flowed seamlessly across borders. But as the trade war raged on, this interconnected system began to unravel. Companies that had long relied on China for inexpensive labor and raw materials began to rethink their strategies. Some companies moved their production to other low-cost countries like Vietnam and India, while others were forced to invest in more expensive domestic production. This disruption in global supply chains affected industries from automotive to consumer electronics, creating long-term shifts in global manufacturing strategies. As the trade war entered its second year, it became clear that the US and China were engaged in more than just a dispute over tariffs. This was a geopolitical struggle for global dominance, with both nations seeking to assert their leadership in the 21st century. The US viewed China's rise as a challenge to its economic and technological supremacy, while China sought to protect its growing influence and push back against what it saw as Western interference in its domestic affairs. Despite the escalating conflict, both nations recognized the importance of reaching a deal. The Phase 1 trade agreement, signed in January 2020, was the first major step toward resolving the trade war. Under the terms of the deal, China agreed to purchase an additional $200 billion worth of American goods over the next 2 years, including agricultural products, energy, and manufacturing goods. In return, the US agreed to reduce some of the tariffs it had imposed on Chinese imports. While the agreement was hailed as a positive development, it was far from a resolution to the deeper issues that had triggered the conflict in the first place. Issues like intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and China's industrial policy remained largely unresolved. The trade war between the US and China, however, was not just about economic policies. It was a direct reflection of the changing global order. The battle for trade supremacy, technological dominance, and geopolitical influence had the potential to reshape the world in ways that no one could have predicted. As both sides continued to navigate this complex conflict, the world watched to see if the economic war would eventually evolve into something much more dangerous, perhaps even a direct military confrontation. This is the new front line. This is the modern battlefield. This is the economic war for the soul of the 21st century. Thank you for watching. If this story gripped you, challenged you, or opened your eyes in any way, do us a favor. Like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep asking the hard questions. Let's keep the conversation going. And let's make sure we never sleep on the battles being fought not on the ground, but behind the scenes. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and stay ready.